Thank you so much, Katrina, for this opportunity to be here to share this paper and get your feedback, and especially to Danielle for serving as a discussant on this. Very much looking forward to your comments. So, as Katrina mentioned, this is joint work with my colleague Phil Kiefer, who unfortunately left us at the World Bank and is now at the IDB. It is work that we did in Benin, actually with a lot of help from Leonard and the research agency he founded in Benin, which gathered the data for us. So I'm particularly delighted to share this here with Leonard in the audience. So what we are going to examine is the role of media on shaping citizens' demand and preferences for different public policies. The motivation for this work comes from looking at preferences for private versus public goods to add to this growing body of evidence that voters respond to information, even in developing country contexts where clientelism is rampant in political systems. In a recent policy research report of the World Bank, we reviewed this growing literature on the role of information in shaping political behavior. And as many of you might know, the EGAP Research Network has been doing a meta study or loosely coordinating a group of studies and adding to this evidence on how information shapes accountability and voter behavior in poor countries. But there are two outstanding questions in this research program that we seek to address. One, whether these information-induced shifts in vote shares, which has been pretty well documented now, reflects greater support for candidates who provide public rather than private goods. So the paper that comes closest to what we are trying to do and from which we've learned a great deal is one that Leonard did with Thomas Fujiwara, where they experiment with public deliberation over a more public goods platform, and experimental candidates that they worked with in Benin adopt this experimental platform that is more public goods oriented, and they indeed find a very interesting pattern of effects when candidates adopt these more public goods campaign platforms. But their inferences for whether these platforms indeed shift citizen demand for broad public goods towards broad public goods are more indirect, and we are hoping to provide more direct measures and evidence on this. And also we move beyond experimental in the field deliberate information campaigns to study the impact of naturally occurring media markets in providing information. The second and related open question is whether overall the availability of information in these information markets promotes broad public interest politics, or is it merely one additional factor which shapes the nature of redistributive politics? So for example, Phil has a paper with Ceci Cruz and Julian Labonne, where they in fact find that providing greater information to voters in the Philippines is associated with candidates increasing vote buying activities in the run-up to the elections. Kate Casey's work in Sierra Leone, where she finds very encouragingly that political debates among candidates reduces ethnic-based voting, cannot really rule out that this information may have led the candidates who participated in these debates to provide greater targeted benefits rather than pay attention to broader public goods. And while we've been doing this Benin project for a while now, Phil and I reviewed the available literature. That's our 2014 JDE paper. And we generally concluded that while there's quite a bit of evidence that more informed voters are able to extract greater private benefits from governments, there's really not a whole lot of evidence on whether more informed voters receive more relatively broader public goods. So for example, the pioneering work of Tim Besley and Robin Burgess showed that greater newspaper circulation in certain parts of India allowed those voters who access greater newspapers to receive greater welfare transfers, food security, and relief during natural disasters from the government. But that leaves open the question of, well, what about need? Why should more informed voters get these more targeted benefits? Shouldn't benefits of this kind be targeted solely on the basis of need? In work that I did with the Poverty Action Lab, Abhijit Banerjee and others, in information campaigns to mobilize communities around education in India, we found really no effect of that information campaign on village political incentives to improve the quality of the public education service delivery. In contrast, we found lots of private action in the villages to directly engage youth in the village, directly engaged in improving education, but nothing on public sector governance. And that was echoed in this paper that I just mentioned that Phil and I did with this data in Benin, where we found that greater access to radio improved literacy outcomes among children, but driven purely by greater private investments of households in the education of their children, not by any impact on public sector governance that we could discern. So the second part of the motivation of this work comes from the literature on the particular role of mass media, separate from these experimental information campaigns. So much of this, the research on the role of mass media is dominated by questions of government accountability, such as whether media reduces corruption. The Besley and Burgess paper is about targeting benefits, but there's also cross-country work that Tim Besley has been involved in and others have done, which show that greater freedom of media is associated with lower corruption indicators. And Fred Finan and Claudio Ferraz have a more micro paper in Brazil where they find that in places, in municipalities with radio, measured incidence of corruption in municipal governments is lower. And then, as I was mentioning just a moment ago, there is also a large literature, more qualitative literature on how media is used to induce behavioral change of the private kind towards attitudes towards health and education. And Phil and I provide some of the first evidence on how media, sort of rigorous empirical evidence testing this role of media, of apolitical public interest media that provide these behavior change messages, and we show that it indeed influences private household demand for the health and education of their children. So these are two papers, one on education and the other on household demand and willingness to pay to acquire bed nets to protect their children and their families from malaria. So the question that we ask in this paper, extending our previous work, is does this apolitical public interest media also influence citizens' public demand for health and education services provided by the government? So our contribution is threefold. First and foremost, we examine the role, we test the impact of this apolitical media, apolitical public interest media, and we find very robust, significant evidence that it indeed shifts citizen demand towards more public goods. Second, and more conceptually, we make a case for the value of separating the analysis of the demand side of political markets from the supply side. So most of the work on information's effects has looked at the equilibrium of the supply and demand, on vote shares in equilibrium of different political parties. But looking only at impact on equilibrium vote shares does not allow us to distinguish the potential impact of media on citizens' political behavior, regardless of how the political supply side responds, how candidates respond. So think back again to the paper I mentioned in the Philippines that Phil, Ceci, and Julian did, where in equilibrium what they find is greater vote buying by the supply side, by the political candidates. But that information may have shifted voter behavior in desirable directions that was not possible to discern in that study, but we do here. And indeed, we document a divergence between media's effect on citizens' demand versus political response. And we discuss in the paper how this suggests very fertile opportunities, pathways for future work to examine media's role separately, and based on that understanding, to target policy initiatives towards supporting media or information campaigns in more well thought out ways. And third, our work identifies the effect of a particular type of media market, which consists of multiple fragmented radio outlets, all of which carry relatively uniform programming content of the public interest kind, of the value of health and education, which is sponsored by donors and government ministries. And we thereby complement a growing literature on how the structure of media markets matter for political outcomes. So I'm in particular thinking about the work that Felipe Campante and others have been doing in a completely different context, in the context of the US, where they examine how opposite conditions of media markets, where audiences are segmented into different media outlets, can be one factor accounting for increasing political polarization in contexts like the US. So we generally contribute to that literature on the role of different structures of media markets. So let me now just jump into the particular context we are studying here. We are taking advantage of the existence of this of a very interesting public interest media market, which is prevalent in most of the African continent. And this is distinguished from previous research, which has examined the impact of newspaper circulation and access to national or commercial TV and radio stations. And although there's been a lot of more qualitative study on the role of this public media in Africa, namely community radio, there's been no prior econometric evidence that we are aware of on the impact of this public interest pro-poor community radio in Africa. These are radio stations that are owned and managed by local community organizations, and they are, as I was mentioning just a moment ago, that receive targeted support from various donors to provide public interest programming. And programming on the importance of health and education is a really prominent part of the programs carried on these radio stations. The Rollback Malaria program sponsors a large number of content on the importance of adopting anti-malaria bed nets and other ways of health promotion. USAID shared with us detailed plans of how they promote content on the importance of education and parents paying attention to their children's education. So our contribution then is to examine the impact of this type of media, which has been specifically tasked with reaching and influencing the poor. We also contribute a novel identification strategy. Past research has relied on in identifying the effect of single national-wide radio or television stations by relying on geologic features that interrupt the broadcast of these stations to some locations and not in others, and sort of arguing why those geologic features are exogenous and satisfy the exclusion restriction. And we argue that our contribution is more likely to address the problems of endogeneity and the exclusion restriction, because we exploit a natural experiment in radio markets in northern Benin, where there are multiple small broadcasters rather than a single broadcasters, for whose possible endogenous location we can control for through commune fixed effects, and then we identify the effect of access to these radio stations by the accident of where signals from multiple radio stations end their reach. So I actually had a whole slide on this. So again, this is an old-fashioned natural experiment study which relies on the history of the establishment of community radio in Benin. The nature of this fragmented radio market allows us to take advantage of substantial within-commune variation across villages in access to multiple radio stations. And we are quite confident that this village-level access to multiple radio stations is driven by conditions exogenous to the village. It's largely driven by where these multiple radio signals from low-powered dispersed stations happen to end their reach. And taking advantage of this radio market, we further tailored our sampling strategy to pick 210 villages in this market, matching them on observable geographic characteristics, namely distance from major roads and from radio towers. So this is our study area in northern Benin. And why northern Benin? Because it fulfills the natural experiment criteria I just described in the previous slide. The southern part of Benin is flooded with radio signals, and it was very hard to find sufficient within commune variation across villages. So here's one department that's colored in the map in the box up on the left-hand side. And so you can see pictorially what we are talking about when we say where multiple signals happen to end their reach. The labeled locations are villages, and so we use these maps to pick villages which looked like they were located very close to each other, but might exhibit post-sampling, post-data collection, variation in how many circles, the circles capture the radio signal propagation, how many circles they happen to fall within, that is how many radio signals they can access. This is another department in our sample, and again you can see there's a lot of variation going on with where radio station signals end their reach, and if we pick our village sample purposively to match them on other types of characteristics, it's only ex post that we would hope to see some variation driven by this accident or where these circles, how many circles they fall within. So after we picked that sample, we did of 210 villages, we did this survey in March of 2009 of 4,200 households picked from these villages in 32 of these northern communes of Benin. The village survey included a detailed module on access to signals from different radio stations, and the household survey, in addition to including information on health and education behavior, which we used for our other two papers, included a module with hypothetical vignettes that pose a direct trade-off between spending on private benefits of a government job, which I'll come to when we discuss the vignettes in detail, which are explicitly described in the vignette as being targeted to a few people and comes at the expense of health and education for all. Oh gosh, okay. All right, so this is, I just want to emphasize from here that our measure of radio access does not come from asking the households which radio they listen to. That would be, of course, subject to lots of different problems. It's relying on our enumerators who were equipped with transistors, turning their transistors on and recording which radio stations they were able to access. This is just some summary data, just describing what I've been saying in words. There are 21 community radio stations serving this area, and each of this have quite small signal strength. That's why we get this accident of how many radio stations happen to end their reach around villages. These community radio are quite distinct from other types of radios in this area in that they carry significantly larger numbers of health and education programs. This is a regression just showing that community radio carries more public interest programming, specifically focusing on the value of health and education. We measure citizen demand through this vignette, where we rely on available literature which has documented how patronage jobs are a salient currency of clientelism, and we contrast it against the provision of broadly delivered health and education for the benefit of all children in a commune. And we do this using the device of a fixed budget constraint, which a hypothetical candidate can only use to provide jobs for a few versus health for all in some vignettes, and in others which we randomized across households versus education for all. So these are the summary statistics. 59%, as many as 59% of the respondents report voting for jobs for some rather than education for all. Little bit less, 49% reported voting for jobs for some rather than health for all. And those that said
they would pick the jobs candidate, also tend to respond in follow-on questions that they think this is generally the right policy for the community. So then we test whether this response of supporting the jobs candidate is influenced by whether the citizen respondent lives in a village with greater access to community radio. And here are the results. The results for health are particularly robust. So when jobs are contrasted against health for all, then citizens living in villages with greater community radio access are significantly less likely to support the jobs candidate. For education, the results are significant only when the sample is confined to households with children, with school-age children. We checked the robustness of this result to many different robustness tests. And then we probed some additional mechanisms which might account for these results, and two of them are particularly important. One, are our results driven by just reducing taste for patronage or clientelism, or is it indeed this channel that we think is that we have other evidence on that radio does affect citizen private demand for health and education? And perhaps even more importantly, is all of this just picking up some social desirability bias in how people are responding to vignette questions when they are sort of flooded with messages of certain kinds from Facebook. And in order to rule out these two alternate interpretations, we rely on a third vignette that we included, which was designed to capture citizens' attitudes to gift giving at the time of elections, which is a euphemism for vote buying. So here's our vignette for presenting citizens with two candidates, one of whom gives gifts and the other does not. And we find that 44% would report voting for the gifts-giving candidate. And of these, 65% respond that they think gifts-giving candidates are more likely to be corrupt. 43% say they may also be more likely to deliver on service delivery promises. But as many as 35% respond that they would vote for the gift-giving candidate, even though they believe the candidate is more likely to be corrupt and no more likely to deliver service promises. So for various reasons, we expect this gift-giving responses to this gift-giving vignette to really capture any action happening with social desirability bias or with attitudes to clientelism more broadly. We find no significant effect of radio access, no matter how we cut the sample, on responses to gift. And so this is our conclusion. We think we are providing novel evidence on the demand side of politics. We are contributing a new measure of citizen demand, which allows us to contrast citizen demand for public versus private goods with an explicit trade-off. It's new evidence of media's effects on this measure of citizen demand. And we conclude with highlighting the many different ways in which this kind of research can be taken forward, not only for research, but also for policy impact on using untapped potential of media markets to promote more public interest politics. Thank you.
Excellent. Danielle, you can go up to the podium or stay seated as per your preference.
Okay, well, I'll try to be brief in my comments. Okay. Well, thanks so much for the opportunity to give some quick feedback on such a fascinating paper. I think as we saw, there's been a lot of attention on the methodological side. I think it's very robust methodologically. A lot of attention up front to potential confounding factors in designing the survey to account for those, even gathering information about the education of village chiefs, which I thought was really interesting to also include that detail as well. And I think also this emphasis that you've concluded with here, focusing on the demand side of politics, is really valuable. I do think that we don't know as much on the demand side as we could, both on the politics and demand for policy preferences. And I think probably the biggest contribution, which you elaborated earlier, was focusing on this kind of natural fragmentation of the media markets, that this isn't one of your kind of normal artificially imposed information campaigns, against graft or clientelism. And I think that's one of the big contributions of the paper. In my view, I think there's a few areas that could be elaborated on a little bit more. The two big ones for me were on concepts and the broader implications that you've made about using community radio to shift from special interest to public interest politics. So first, on the public versus private goods, I had a little bit of trouble believing that bed nets and more books and training for teachers were public goods in the traditional sense of being non-excludable and non-rivalrous. I think they're definitely social goods, right? I mean, having vaccinations, having bed nets, having your children educated, they have larger positive externalities. But then I would think also, people being employed also have those income externalities, creating more demand for local goods and services. So the complete distinction as to whether these were really, private versus public goods, I think could be drawn out a little bit more. And I think particularly on the jobs vignette, I'm not sure if you see it as patronage because it's about government jobs per se, or because it's just for a few people. I mean, Ghana recently has this one factory per district policy to create employment for the youth. I don't know, would we see that as a clientelist policy because they're targeting just the youth, or would we see it as a broader public good because it's not particularly government employment, but it's about attracting industry and the private sector? So I think what element is it of the jobs that is really seen as clientelism? And then I think, relatedly to that, when we talk about special interest politics, we're often talking about policies that disproportionately favor the few at the expense of the many. I don't know if jobs in Benin are analogous to special interest politics. We know unemployment is the kind of overriding challenge in Africa. Afrobarometer repeatedly shows unemployment is the main policy priority for both rural and urban areas. So I kind of worry about the implication that those who prefer the jobs candidates are more interested in patronage and private goods rather than simply concerned with unemployment. And I thought it was interesting you found that the poorest households were more likely to favor the jobs candidates. So I was also wondering if you had information on the unemployment of the respondent and whether that made any difference to choosing that vignette. Don't know how much time I have left, but I'll just keep going here. I was also interested in the degree to which the presence of donors in these villages, whether that played any role in some of the patterns that you're seeing, because you note that a lot of these community radios are heavily supported by donors. So I'm also wondering if the donors are also in some of these villages, but not in others, engaged in more public health or education activities. So really, is it the radio per se, or is it actually donor presence in distributing bed nets or teacher training? Okay, that's driving some of these results. I think also, I sometimes wondered if the comparison was a bit unfair between the public versus private good distinction and implications for mass media. I mean, public service announcements about bed nets and vaccinations, teacher training, these are relatively straightforward. These are balanced goods. Who really disagrees with them? More of them are better in this sense. But job creation, whether it's government or private sector, it involves more difficult policy decisions. It always involves trade-offs, and implicitly becomes much more political. It's hard to have an apolitical public service announcement about job creation. And so, one, these issues are inherently more political, so you wouldn't see donors or community radio talking about this on the radio. And secondly, it involves more complex trade-offs that really kind of local community radio staff in rural Benin are probably not engaging and thinking about. So, I mean, these community radios, they're not only providing messaging on health and education, but they're most likely not providing messaging on job policies. So I think the paper's showing that the messaging is clearly very effective coming from these community radios, but not necessarily that the respondents are becoming more public goods oriented. They're just maybe not being exposed to other messaging on other policies. And then my last point is linked to this idea about separating the demand and the supply side of politics. Again, I think it's really critical to be focusing on the demand side, but we know in the real world that there is we do have to think about the equilibrium and the interaction. And we know that people vote on the charisma of the politician, the experience of the politician, the ethnicity of the politician. So to really test whether whether the media can affect people's perceptions and demands for public goods, I would think potentially a next step could be thinking more about what you were talking about earlier about the role of public debates, televised debates that you see more and more candidates in Africa doing. I think even in the last Benin election, they had these televised debates. So potentially looking at that kind of interaction between community messaging and what the politician messaging is, and can you see a stronger effect coming out of it? But again, I think that's why this fragmentation of the radio markets is such an important angle, because it is getting more of that kind of realistic kind of experimental approach to looking at the role of information. And I think what's the bigger point coming out of your paper is that the radio can be meaningfully used to educate citizens on policy nuances and debates, rather than just that the radio can adjust people's attitudes from special to public interest politics. Because, as I mentioned before, not all policies can be boiled down to public service announcements. Thank you so much for such a great paper.
Thank you so much for those remarks, Danielle. Stuti, if you would like to respond to anything Danielle said, feel free, or otherwise we can open for Q&A.
Why don't we open it up?
Okay, we'll maximize comments that way. All right, show of hands if you've got questions for Stuti here.
Danielle, go. I was fascinated by this kind of donor-funded model and this question about.
Oh, sorry if I could be a pain here. Could you guys turn on the mics here when you're speaking, just for our online participants? I think you just push the button right below. Yep.
Great.
Turn green. Thank you.
Okay, I think it's on. Yeah. So I'm just curious about sort of the kind of policy implications of this, because it strikes me that these kind of donor-funded community radio stations is kind of very kind of strikes me as a special scenario that I don't know how common it is and how sustainable it is. And the reason why I wonder about this is just because my familiarity with community radio is through Latin America, and those tend to be quickly kind of dominated by politicians and become associated with politicians and become essentially even though they're not supposed to be, a vehicle for promoting a particular political group or candidate. And so I'd just be really interested to hear your thoughts about, you see any risk of that happening, say if donor funds dried up, or even with the presence of donor funds, that because obviously if they're having this effect, you'd think politicians would be quite interested in making friends with some of these guys.
More questions, comments? Don't be shy.
It occurred to me that the version of demand that you focus on, of choosing in a menu of political choices, choosing the choice you want them to make, is one version of demand. But a lot of the other versions of political demand, I would think it would be taking some positive action, like joining a demonstration, writing a letter to your congressman or whatever. And I don't know if fieldwork is still ongoing, but it seems like it would be important, or at least interesting, to figure out if there's any action on that dimension too. So the idea would be, if you invite people in a community where you had the campaign, are they more likely to show up to a demonstration or a public lecture or some sort of positive event, or offer them? Would you be willing to write a letter to your local person, something like that? Is there any sort of positive action as opposed to just a choice on the menu that you want them to make?
Okay. The distinction between clientelism and programmatic, when you are talking about job, what is it exactly? I mean, like, for instance, if I'm offering, there is no indication that the job offering is actually to reward political supporters, per se. If there's no clear indication that it will reward in exchange of services, then why this would be perceived as I think this distinction.
Do you want to perhaps answer a few of those questions, Stuti, and then we'll see if we generate more questions.
So I think thank you all for your comments and especially Daniel. I think the conceptual questions that Daniel raised are exactly along the lines that you raised. And it is in fact something we struggled with quite a bit in the paper to describe and elucidate. In an early version, we had in fact described the vignettes and the jobs offer as a clientelist vignette, and the feedback in other presentations such as yours made us pull back from that and realize that the contribution is really much more about the allocation of public resources across two competing ends rather than necessarily clientelist. Having said that, having said that, I think we now have much more discussion in the paper about how this deliberate choice of to contrast jobs against jobs for some. That language is crucial. Jobs for a few versus spending on inputs in health and education that the wording of the vignette says would be for the benefit of all in the community. So takes away the redistributive zero-sum game of public spending versus jobs maintains that. So I think we do interpret this, and as we describe in more detail in the paper, not about clientelism and patronage per se, although our choices of what to contrast with against what was driven by what we understand about the local context, and jobs was not accidental. It was a deliberate choice to evoke certain, to make it more realistic, that this is what people are used to hearing as political promises. We are very careful about not overdoing the interpretation so we do not interpret it as whether it's for or against clientelism, but we believe it's a useful device to examine citizen responses to relative appeals. This kind of device has not been used in earlier literature. But I do agree with all of the conceptual problems you're raising. And yet we do provide this rooting in prior literature on, for example, how jobs of teachers and health workers in developing countries appears to function de facto as patronage because of huge accountability problems of not showing up and not teaching even when present in schools. And we do rely on the health vignette to capture some of the pure public goods elements that public health spending, even if it is de facto on a targeted private good of a malaria bed net, saturating the population with bed nets and encouraging them to use bed nets regularly is servicing a public health good of reducing propagation of a communicable disease. I don't know how much time I have, so let me just...
We've got about 3 more minutes for Stuti's paper. Any other comments that have come up here? Yes, Mark.
So just to follow up on that point and try to put a point on it. So why not jobs for me versus jobs for some as the vignette, and to think about whether this was or jobs for my household as a private good versus jobs for some? And is it possible that being exposed to this public good messaging would change the respondents' beliefs about whether me is included in that some when they're exposed to the vignette? Now they're exposed to people thinking about, more even redistribution of goods of some kind, and think, well, jobs for some probably doesn't mean jobs for me now. It means, jobs for the public distributed more equitably. Like can we? Is that a plausible explanation to put a point on some of these in the language? And why did you choose some rather than my household?
Yeah, go for it.
So I think if we had done that, it would, we wouldn't have gotten much interesting variation. So maybe we would have loaded the vignette with social desirability bias. When asked directly, job for you versus health for everyone, I mean, whatever you might do in private, how would you respond to that? So I don't think that was a realistic option for us. But what you raise is something that we did try. So when we tried this vignette in another context, because we are using it in other work in Tanzania, and we were field testing it, very interestingly, the respondents, these were mostly government officials who are very savvy to and the government officials almost always responded in the quote-unquote right direction of never choosing the jobs candidate in these vignette. But interestingly, households were very different and looked very much like the Benin sample. They pushed us on what does jobs for some mean? What is the purpose of giving jobs for some? So we had to reword our vignette in Tanzania to jobs for poor people. And so, because otherwise the vignette didn't make sense to them. Why would any politician offer jobs for some? What does that mean? So as I said, in Tanzania, despite rewording it like that and making the jobs vignette, and this goes back to your earlier conceptual questions, making the jobs vignette appear more programmatic as an anti-poverty tool, citizens still tended to, the officials still picked the health and education offer. Because I think in this context, everyone thinks about jobs as, because it's targetable, it serves a quid pro quo. And in fact, just one quick response back to Leonard and Danielle, we discuss how in this context, there's no programmatic workfare scheme like the kind in India. We discuss how it's not even like Bolsa Familia or something, those kinds of programmatic social welfare schemes in Brazil. So in this context, jobs for some really cannot be construed as, oh, this must be a social protection program. It's very hard to use the literature to make the case that this must be a jobs program that is going to give some positive externality to the economy in some way.